Hi and welcome again. Thanks as always so much for coming, and I know it's getting busier and busier for you, and we really do appreciate the time and interest in this. So today we're going to have a look at feedback, and obviously feedback can have we can understand feedback in two different contexts. It can be about us providing feedback to students, or students providing feedback to us. And it's the latter idea, than getting feedback off of students in terms of, I guess, really how successful our lectures are, that I'm interested in exploring this morning. So I'm going to start, as usual, with a thought for yourselves. Gathering feedback is not something that we do as a routine practice here in CIT off of students. It's not formal. There's not a formal mechanism for doing it. Why do you think it's not common practice? And the second question, what's the benefit of not having feedback from students? So if you just take a minute, and again, I'd like you to think about those two questions. We'll have a short discussion, and I'll invite some feedback or some ideas off of you, if that's okay. Okay, can we get some thoughts off of you? The first question, why do you think it's not common practice? Time. Okay. Culture, yeah. Yeah, I would say that's a big part of it. And the benefit of not having feedback? It's a nice one, yeah. Yeah. You feel comfortable when they tell you how fantastic you are. And so one of the things we're going to have a look at is like why we should be collecting feedback off students. I'm going to, I guess, provide some reasons based on my own experience of collecting feedback off students of the benefits of it. I'm going to give you some examples of the things that I have found, I guess, and we're going to look at some of the kind of typical resources, the typical ways that we might go about collecting this. So you should be able to explain some of the purposes associated, use different approaches, and use like end of question or end of semester questionnaires. So I'm going to primarily focus on questionnaires in this session because they're very simple to use. There's lots of them out there. You don't need to create them, and it's very easy to analyze them. So unlike interviews or focus groups or stuff like that, which take an awful lot more time, particularly to analyze and make sense of the data that comes from them, student questionnaires are in comparison, very simple and easy to use. And hence the focus here. When we come to collecting feedback off students, there's it can be done for lots of different purposes. So there can be institutional reasons why you collect feedback off students, which can be about rating staff and all those types of things. There can be sector-wide rating. I'm not interested in any of those reasons for collecting feedback. For me, feedback is about coming to understand what we're doing and being able to do it better, I guess, ultimately. But it's about understanding that teaching and learning, and students are, in my view, really well placed to inform us on that sort of process and what works for them and the things that they're finding difficult, and therefore coming to understand that better. So one of the, I guess, for me personally, one of the purposes of collecting feedback is to understand that process better. The second, I guess, purpose, which is related to that but slightly different, is then, about improving practice. But improving practice in a kind of focused and directed sort of a way. So, like if we start there at the bottom with that evaluating, so by collecting some feedback from students and looking, reflecting on that feedback, we may identify issues that are there. We can then plan around those issues. We can do an implementation, and we can repeat that cycle so that it becomes a very targeted sort of intervention. It's not some random thing that we're doing just because you think it might work well or something like that. So it allows us to go about that process of improving practice in a sort of in a sort of focused way, and that would be one of the other arguments that I would have for collecting feedback, is that it really supports that type of process and engaging in that sort of practice. So as a specific example of that, on the Masters in Teaching and Learning, we have a module which is called Improving Practice, where we encourage staff to engage in that cycle, so to collect feedback of students, to analyse that feedback, to identify some issues that they can maybe address, and go about an implementation and seeing how it works. And one of the staff was in their teaching was he was using questions. So it's related to last week's session. So they were using questions as they were solving problems. So they put a problem up on the board or up in the overhead, and then ask students, starting, for example, with Maurice, how would you start this problem? And then going on to Irene, what's the next stage in the problem? And John, what's the next stage? And going around students one by one, time to think about the question first of all. So it's what we would call, what the literature would call cold calling. It's, here's the problem, and what's the solution, or what's the first step, and what's the next step, and the third step. So that was their practice, and they were doing it for the best of intentions. In this was about engaging students and getting them to think and finding out what they know and that sort of stuff. We were very surprised when they went and did this evaluation. And one of the questions was an open-ended question, which was about what were the things that students really disliked. And the majority of the responses was around this practice of the questions and the way it made students feel. And very interestingly, the impact that it has on learning. Stop asking people individually what the answers are. It puts people under pressure and prevents them from learning as they only focus on the question they're being asked. Okay, so even though this staff member, as I said, had the best of intentions in terms of this practice, when they went and asked students how it works for them, they got a very different perspective on the practice that they were engaged in, because students were not finding that it was something useful for them, or certainly wasn't finding something that it wasn't something that worked for them. So often, I guess, teaching and learning is a very complicated thing. There are lots of factors that are at play, and sometimes it's not always obvious, what is going to work, and sometimes things that we think that might work can tend to have an inverse effect or a different effect. The only way we'll ever know is when we ask students what's working for them. And sometimes we can be, surprised with the sorts of responses that come back. As I'm going through this, if you have questions or thoughts, please feel free, as always, to ask.
Tom,
sure.
On that, I suppose a lot of people have that practice of asking questions and putting it out to the floor. So do you discuss an alternative or kind of ideas around what you could do instead of that? Because it's a common practice.
It is a very common practice. One of the things we had talked about last week was then to, when we ask students questions, to give them time, first of all, to think about it, so that you're not immediately putting them on the spot. Yeah. So one of the issues is the fact that they're immediately put on the spot. Here's the question, I don't have time to think about it, which you're asking me for a response. And that obviously creates a lot of tension and for things. And the second thing then would be, Again, if following that you give them time for a discussion in small groups and stuff like that, that then helps them as well, because it's not them individually, it's that group and that group response. Yeah. Yeah.
And it takes that pressure off.
Exactly. So it addresses the first one, not to single out a student. So no, it's not a student; it's a group. And it's the response of that group. So even if the group is, even if the answer is not right, it's less intimidating, I guess, or there's less impact on those students. The third thing you can use, but again, it's not going to work for everything, is technology, and use those audience response systems, which then make it anonymous and stuff, and therefore it's not, individuals that are being. And the session tomorrow, the teaching with technology guys are going to be looking at the use of those systems in terms of getting feedback off students. So this is in relation to the second purpose, which is about improving practice. By getting data from our students, we can identify things that are working, things that aren't working so well, and then, as I said, have targeted intervention. So we're going to address, for example, in this case, this practice and improve this practice, and therefore improve, I guess. I would say that there is also personally a third purpose, which is often about defending some of the choices that we've made, and particularly if some of those choices may seem somewhat controversial. So throughout this series, I've been suggesting that we should sacrifice content for the purpose of making room for understanding. And one of the comments last week, which maybe in hindsight I didn't fully address, was it could also be interpreted when we sacrifice content, or when I suggest to get rid of content, that we're dumbing down courses, that we're making courses easier, which is a very legitimate perspective. Right? If we go and collect evidence from students, we should be able then to support, that one or either of those courses, so that, it's not that easy, even though you've gone and removed all this, or lots of this content. So when I do this with my students, so this is from one module. I've collected it over 3 years, from 2013, 14, and 15. I guess so. It's the response of about 60-odd students. If we start, to what extent do the assessment tasks in this module challenge you to do your best work? 97% of them are saying that they're challenged. Do you have to work harder than you expected to meet the standards of the instructor? 90% are saying yes. How difficult was the course material in this module? 61% are saying that it's difficult. Right? So even though if I take that module and compare it with the standard modules that are out there, I have no content in it. Right? Compared with lots of other modules that I see. And yet, students do not find this easy, because we've shifted from covering lots of material on a very surface sort of level to expecting them to understand, a much more restricted kind of curriculum. And students are always going to be challenged by that. They're always going to be challenged by understanding and by the requirement for understanding. So by doing this, we're not necessarily making courses easier. And when it comes to review panels and programmatic reviews, and they look at it and say, well, look, it looks very light, then I can justify what we're doing and say, yes, it may look like that, but there is a real challenge there for students in terms of understanding those concepts, and that's, the focus, and that's what we're about, and here's the evidence to support that perspective, so that you have a basis, at least, for an argument. It's not just my opinion versus your opinion, which is more difficult.
John, could I just ask on that, though, if you're going to reduce content, and if I'm interpreting you correctly, yes, what you're saying then is that when you focus in on a more limited amount of material, but you go deeper into it, yes, and maybe look at it in a more challenging way, is there a risk then that you're doing something that would be picked up in a third-year module, or is maybe your subject area is such that it's not, I'm sort of saying, if we, teaching first years and second years, if we reduce our content, go into things in more detail, then when the student meets the material in third year or fourth year, are they saying, we did this already? Is there that?
Not really. So if I take like one of the contexts where I'd be most familiar with this would be like physics, right? So in first year, in the Leavenscert, the physics curriculum is hugely broad. You come into first year here, and often they're again faced with very broad lookings. When you ask students about the principles underlining those, most of them don't understand force. They don't understand momentum. They can't apply it to anything like a new topic or a new concept. So they can kind of work through routine examples, but if you go outside that narrow kind of thing, they don't get it. They don't really understand the concept. So what I'm saying is, even those very basic ideas, in order for students to understand them, there needs to be a lot more explanation, there needs to be a lot more examples, there needs to be a lot more rigor around the explanation so that students get the actual idea. So it's not necessarily that we're traveling to, let's say, third and fourth year sort of material. It's still the same material, but we're shifting from kind of a very surface level understanding.
Rather than them just learning off by heart the method of the question, that they can now actually be thrown a different type of question and have the tools to know how to approach it.
Yeah, we never did this before. Exactly that sort of notion. Yeah, and that takes a lot of time. You know, it's not something that you can do. It's not something that you can do very easily. So, my argument would be, if you have lots of content in your course, you just don't have the time to do this, and therefore you're likely to encourage surface approaches and those types of things. And obviously, when we're setting up challenging courses or when we're trying to challenge students, we need to be also conscious of the workload. So it's very easy to create challenging courses which are challenging just because we've piled in work into it and it's over the top. It's too much for students. So, like some of the other sorts of questions that are there are about the workload. 87% are saying that that's about right. When I look at the hours that they report that they're doing per week, they're consistent with the notion of they should be putting in 7 hours per week into this module, this independent learning and all that sort of stuff. So it would seem that, you know, I think one of the things we need to be wary of then is when we are creating those challenges, that challenge is reasonable and that it's manageable for students. So, you know, just having challenging courses by themselves is not a good thing. That challenge needs to be supported and it needs to be sort of reasonable. So as I said, the third reason, I guess, then is about being able to, I guess, argue about certainly some of maybe the more controversial choices that we might make about, you know, some of the aspects of our course, and evidence from students can help support that. The slide includes, I guess, some more evidence from one of the course that I did last year. It's a different set of questions. But it's, I guess, is related to the notion that if we reduce content and try and focus on understanding that this can work. So if I start down at the bottom in studying for CS is the control systems, that's the module I was teaching. In studying for the control systems module, I've tried to find out for myself what the handouts mean. So this is a statement that's often associated with deep approaches to learning. So they're looking for meaning in those things as opposed to just learning them off. So the two last statements there, one is a statement that would be associated with deep approaches to learning, and the one above it would be a statement that's associated with surface approaches to learning, that what I've learned seems no more than unrelated bits and pieces in my mind. Now, in the questionnaire, there'll be a whole series of these types of questions, and then you aggregate them, so I'm just taking examples of them here. This is on a 5-point scale, so 1 to 5, so like 4.4 out of 5 is pretty good. And likewise, you'd be expecting I would be hoping that the one above it, which is to do with the surface approaches, would be low, you know, so that students aren't adopting surface approaches and stuff. And 2 is consistent with that. And then there's a couple of other questions in that, which is around, you know, you really had to understand the subject to get good marks, an average of 4.7. Teaching encouraged me to rethink my understanding, an average of 4.8. So there's evidence there of that philosophy of reducing content and focusing on understanding that works, that students are getting it, that they're and that focus is working. So I guess in terms of the things that I've been talking to you about, in terms of the things that I've been trying to do in my own practice, when we collect evidence of students, we can see then whether those are working and whether the approach is I guess whether the approach is working. Yes.
Okay. Just one final question. What would typical class size for the groups that you have?
It varies. So
Give us the smallest.
60 students.
60.
Yeah, would be the largest. 12 students would be the smallest. This would be from this was from last year. There would have been 35 in that group last year.
Absolutely. Do you ever ask open-ended questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you ask them separately to that?
No, I usually have them at the end. So I'd have nearly always two open-ended questions. What did you like? I actually have them later on. What did you like about the module, and what suggestions would you have for improvement? And I'm not trying to suggest here that everything is perfect. Like, so one of the questions is there, looking back in the module, are there any aspects that you would recommend for improvement? And this time around, there's certainly a lot of one of the themes that's coming out of there is about the reports and about how they're finding those really challenging, and the suggestions that maybe there could be more supports around those and stuff. And then we're back to that cycle. So now I have evidence, there's something I can think about and decide what I want to do with it, plan, implement, and hopefully improve it. And the next time around, then that doesn't feature as a theme, for example.
I just mention that I do seek feedback from my students, and I usually do it in the middle of the semester and at the end of the semester, but kind of have an ulterior motive, much that I want their information. Some of the questions I ask them relate to things like, because I usually seek the feedback after they've done an interim exam for me. So I ask them things like, did you get the mark you're expected to get? And I ask them things like, are you a regular attender? But I score it like I attend always, never, sometimes. And I ask, do you demonstrate what tutorials do? So this is all, so my ulterior motive is that by doing it in the middle of the semester, it makes them think, okay, I wasn't that happy with my result. But then the next question is, well, I wasn't there very often, and I didn't go to the tutorial. So much that I make, it's like there's a message in this for you as well. There's the other half of the semester to go. But
no, I think that's brilliant. So in terms of just gathering some feedback, I'm going to very quickly, and this is much more straightforward, discuss 4 different ways. Active learning, I think, is really useful. We talked about this last week in the context of questions. Using personal response systems, I think, is really powerful in terms of getting instant feedback from students. So here was a question that I would have set up, that I would have given to my group like 4 weeks ago. And as we talked about last week, the correct response here is number 2. So I can see immediately that 60% of my class misunderstand the concept, and therefore, in my perspective, I have no choice but to go back and reteach that. So I'm getting instant feedback on the teaching, kind of live, if you like, and therefore we can adapt or change as we're going through. And again, the nice thing about audience response systems is you're looking at the majority of the class, as opposed to maybe 1 or 2, and reacting to feedback or input from 1 or 2, which may or may not be representative of the entire class. Lots of places recommend this idea of minute papers, which might be at the end of the class, that you might ask students to summarize the main points. What did you find difficult? What sort of questions do you have? In your own words, explain, maybe the main concept of the lecture or something like that. So at the end of the class, you might ask them on a separate sheet of paper to write out their, response to this. Give them 2 or 3 minutes to do it. You collect that off them. You can look at it in between that class and the next class and see, is there evidence that they got the idea? Do they understand it? Do I need to go back and reteach it? Are there questions or issues that they have? And it's really important that we go back to the class and discuss the findings with them, because if they think that they're doing this and you're just dumping it into the bin, or it's just a pile on your desk, then they're going to stop doing it. So we need to go back and say, even if the stuff is very positive, look, I looked through them, like 90% of you seem to get the idea, I'm really happy with that, and we're going to move on. Right? But you need to go back to the class and discuss the findings of that with them, otherwise it stops being effective. They will stop engaging with it. As Sinead mentioned, midterm evaluations are really useful things, and often they can be quite simple. You may have multiple choice questions in them, but lots of the time I would have just the 2 open-ended questions that are down there. What do you like best about this module? Or are there aspects that you would like to change? And again, the advantage of it's really short, okay? And you get really, and in fairness, in terms of even the end of semester evaluations, I have those 2 questions, and often the most useful, the most interesting information is in those 2 questions in terms of, things that I can. So, for example, the 2 examples that we've here, looking back in the module, are their aspects, so that they talk about the reports. That's an open-ended question, so if I'm finding 5 or 6 comments on the same theme, that's obviously an issue. Like, I'm not prompting this. There's no prompts anywhere to say, talk about reports or anything like that. So if that theme is coming out of that data in open-ended questions, it means it's really, to me, it's something that is bothering them and something that I need to take seriously. And in the same token, if, we need to be wary when we're looking at this and ignore, by and large, single comments. So we're always likely to get odd, strange, unusual single comments there. It's very easy to get fixated on them and say, look, I need to do something about that. I'm very conscious that, I would be saying, no, you don't. You address the themes. And there's a whole heap of end-of-term semester, that's fine, end-of-semester evaluations, which are on there in slide 15. You can have a look at those. And I have one example on the very end of the handout, which is kind of an amalgamation of some of those, which I've put together as an example questionnaire, which might be useful if it's kind of the first time you're starting off the teaching workload, and the sorts of open-ended questions that are there too. If anyone wants, I can obviously, I'm very happy to send you on the electronic copy of it. Just send me an email and I'll email it on to you. And all of those other ones you'll find if you do a search online, use Google and take the name of the evaluation. Student evaluations are important because I think it informs, it diagnoses, it affirms, it can justify, it can improve, and all those things. There's a lot of controversy around them. Lots of people don't believe in them. I would be suggesting to you, think of your own experience as a student, as an undergraduate, and of the lecturers that you had, and can you identify the good ones and the bad ones, the ones that worked for you and the ones that didn't? And if you can do it, your students can do it. So I absolutely believe that they're very well equipped. They've had teaching experiences from the age of 4 to whatever they are now, 18, 19, 20, 16 years possibly of having teaching done onto them. They're very well positioned to know what works for them and what doesn't work for them. And by and large, the literature would support that when they look at that student evaluations of teaching are accurate and reliable and all those types of things. So there's something that I find really useful. There's something that I think should be done a lot more than they are done. But as I said at the start, my argument for using them is about improving our own practice. Thank you so much.